A courtier mocked the human girl's accent at the banquet. A week later, the vampire king invited her to perform at court. The laughter started when Rosalind Thorne mispronounced horse doves at the diplomatic banquet, and Lord Cassian Vane, vampire courtier extraordinaire, fashion arbiter of the Court of Shadows, and professional snob, made certain everyone heard his perfectly enunciated correction, followed by the observation that one can dress provincial girls in silk, but apparently cannot teach them to speak like civilized beings. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. The banquet hall of the Silver Keep was legendary for its opulence. Vaulted ceilings painted with celestial frescoes, chandeliers dripping crystal that caught candlelight and transformed it into cascading rainbows, tables laden with delicacies from across the known world. It was meant to demonstrate the wealth and power of King Lucian Ashford, vampire monarch of the eastern provinces, to the assembled diplomats from both human kingdoms and supernatural territories. Rosalind shouldn't have been there at all. She was a translator, specifically a translator of ancient texts, employed by the human contingent to assist with a complicated trade negotiation involving mineral rights in border territories. The invitation to the banquet had been a formality extended to all members of the diplomatic party, and she'd debated whether attending would be more awkward than declining. She'd chosen wrong. The dress her employer had provided was beautiful, midnight blue silk that complemented her dark auburn hair and made her gray eyes look almost silver. But it was still obviously not tailored specifically for her, still marked her as someone who'd been dressed appropriately rather than someone who naturally belonged in such finery. Her accent, acquired from growing up in the rural highlands of Thornwick Province, became more pronounced when she was nervous. And she was very, very nervous. The disaster had occurred during the reception, when a server had offered her a tray of elaborate appetizers. Rosalind had wanted to decline politely, but her supervisor had given her a sharp look that clearly communicated she was expected to participate in the social aspects of the evening, not just lurk in corners with documents. "What are these?" she'd asked the server quietly, genuinely wanting to know so she could make an informed choice. "Horse dove, mademoiselle," the server had replied. "Specifically, goat cheese with fig compote on brioche." Rosalind had attempted to repeat the phrase, horse duvers, and immediately realized from the server's carefully neutral expression that she'd butchered it spectacularly. She'd been about to laugh at herself, to acknowledge the mistake with grace, when Lord Cassian's voice had cut through the ambient conversation. "Or dove," had enunciated, slowly, as though speaking to a child or someone particularly slow-witted. Honestly, one can dress provincial girls in silk, but apparently cannot teach them to speak like civilized beings. How quaint that the human delegation brings their rustics to formal functions now. Next, they'll be inviting shepherds and milkmaids to diplomatic negotiations. The laughter that followed hadn't been universal. Some courtiers looked uncomfortable, others seemed to find it genuinely amusing. But it had been loud enough, pointed enough, that everyone in the immediate vicinity had turned to look at Rosalind, marking her as the object of mockery. Her face had burned. She mumbled something that might have been an excuse and retreated to the farthest corner of the banquet hall, where she'd spent the rest of the evening pretending to study the architectural details while fighting back tears of humiliation. The worst part wasn't the mockery itself. Rosalind had endured plenty of that over the years, being a Highland girl with academic ambitions in circles that valued pedigree over competence. The worst part was that Lord Cassian was right about one thing. She didn't belong here. She was a translator who'd learned 5 languages through grueling self-study, who'd earned her position through talent and determination, but who would always sound like she came from sheep country. She'd left the banquet as soon as protocol allowed, returned to her small room in the diplomatic wing, and spent half the night wondering if she should resign before she was dismissed for embarrassing the human delegation. That had been a week ago. Now, standing in her room holding an envelope bearing the royal seal, Rosalind wondered if she was about to be formally reprimanded or possibly expelled from the negotiations entirely. The seal itself was intimidating, deep crimson wax embossed with King Lucian's personal crest, delivered by a royal messenger who'd waited while she signed for it with shaking hands. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the heavy parchment inside. Miss Rosalind Thorne, you are cordially invited to present a performance at the Court of Shadows on the evening of the autumn equinox. His Majesty, King Lucian Ashford, requests your participation in the royal demonstration of arts, wherein scholars, artists, and craftsmen showcase their talents before the assembled court. Your performance should demonstrate your particular area of expertise and run no longer than 30 minutes. All materials and assistance required will be provided upon request. Attendance is expected. Appropriate formal attire will be provided by the Royal Wardrobe. By order of His Majesty, Margaret Chen, Royal Chancellor. Rosalind read it 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding something. A performance? At court? The Royal Demonstration of Arts was legendary, an annual event where the vampire court showcased the most impressive talents from across the territories. Composers premiered symphonies, master painters unveiled commissions, renowned poets recited original works. Why, in any conceivable reality, would King Lucian invite a Highland translator who couldn't pronounce French words correctly? A knock on her door interrupted her spiraling confusion. She opened it to find her supervisor, Ambassador Helena Winters, looking both pleased and calculating. "You received the invitation," Helena said. It wasn't a question. "I don't understand. Why would His Majesty—" "Because he saw what happened at the banquet. Apparently, he was less amused by Lord Cassian's performance than some of the courtiers were." Helena entered the room uninvited, closing the door behind her. "This is an opportunity, Rosalind, a significant one. The king is known for occasionally elevating talented individuals who've been overlooked or underestimated. If you perform well, it could change your career trajectory entirely. Or I could humiliate myself in front of the entire court and destroy any credibility I've built." "That's also possible," Helena agreed with characteristic bluntness. "But you have 2 choices. Decline the invitation and spend the rest of your career as that girl who was mocked at the banquet, or accept and demonstrate why you were hired despite your provincial origins." Rosalind bristled at the phrasing, but couldn't entirely disagree with the assessment. "What would I even perform? I'm a translator. That's not exactly theatrical." "That's for you to determine. You have 2 weeks to prepare. I suggest you think creatively." Helena moved toward the door, then paused. "Rosalind, I hired you because you're brilliant with languages. You taught yourself Old Vampiric from fragmentary texts when scholars twice your age couldn't parse basic grammar. You've translated documents that unlocked trade agreements worth millions. Don't let one pompous courtier convince you that you're anything less than extraordinary." After Helena left, Rosalind sat on her bed, holding the invitation and trying to quiet the competing voices in her head. Fear said to decline, to avoid the risk of further humiliation. Pride said to accept, to prove Lord Cassian wrong. But beneath both was something else. Curiosity about why King Lucian had extended this particular invitation to this particular person at this particular time. She'd heard stories about King Lucian Ashford, 400 years old, considered one of the most sophisticated monarchs in vampire history, known equally for his diplomatic brilliance and his absolute intolerance for cruelty disguised as wit. He was said to value talent over pedigree, competence over charm, substance over style. If even half the stories were true, this invitation wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated, meant to accomplish something beyond simply giving a translator a chance to perform. Rosalind made her decision. She would accept. Not because she was certain she'd succeed, but because the alternative, spending her life wondering what might have been, was worse than the risk of failure. She just needed to figure out what exactly she was going to do for 30 minutes that would justify King Lucian's faith in her. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation, panic, and gradual crystallization of an idea that was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. Rosalind's initial instinct had been to do something conventional, perhaps translate a famous speech from Old Vampiric to Modern Common, demonstrating linguistic evolution. But that felt safe, boring. Then, while researching in the court library, because of course the vampires had an incredible library, they'd had centuries to accumulate books, she'd stumbled across something interesting, a collection of courtly insult poetry from the Third Dynasty, written in a dialect of Old Vampiric that had fallen out of use centuries ago. Vampire courtiers of that era had elevated insults to an art form. They'd compose poems that appeared to be compliments on the surface, but were actually devastating criticisms when you understood the linguistic subtleties. Double meanings, homophonic wordplay, grammatical structures that changed meaning based on inflection. It was linguistic warfare disguised as entertainment. And suddenly, Rosalind knew exactly what she was going to do. She spent 12 hours a day for the next week working on her performance. She studied pronunciation guides, practiced inflections until her throat was raw, and carefully constructed something that would demonstrate her linguistic abilities while also, if she was very brave and very lucky, making a point about the difference between mockery and wit. The royal wardrobe delivered her dress 3 days before the performance. It was stunning. Deep forest green velvet with gold embroidery at the cuffs and collar, cut in a style that was both formal and somehow suited to her rather than merely appropriate. A note accompanied it. Miss Thorne, His Majesty felt this color would complement your complexion and heritage. The embroidery pattern is traditional to Thornwick Province, should you wish to honor your origins. Marguerite Chen. Rosalind had nearly cried. After years of being made to feel that her Highland origins were something to overcome or hide, someone, King Lucian apparently, had chosen to honor them instead. On the day of the performance, Rosalind woke with a mixture of terror and determination. She practiced her pronunciation one final time, checked and rechecked her notes, and tried not to think about the fact that she'd be performing in front of hundreds of vampires, diplomats, and courtiers who'd be evaluating her every word, every gesture, every breath. The royal demonstration of arts was held in the Grand Hall, even larger and more impressive than the banquet hall, with a raised stage at one end and tiered seating that could accommodate 1,000 spectators. By the time Rosalind arrived, Escorted by a royal page who seemed bemused by how nervous she was, the hall was already filling. She was scheduled to perform fifth after a violinist, a portrait painter, a fire dancer, and a composer. The performances before her were exceptional. The violinist played a piece so complex and beautiful that half the audience wept. The painter created a work in real time that was immediately purchased by a wealthy merchant. The fire dancer defied physics, and the composer's piece was declared an instant classic. Then it was her turn. Rosalind walked onto the stage, her green velvet dress catching the light, her Highland accent suddenly feeling less like a liability and more like a distinctive feature. The audience quieted. She could see Lord Cassian in the third row, looking vaguely amused and clearly expecting her to fail spectacularly. She could see Ambassador Helena, tense with hope and worry. And she could see King Lucian on his throne, his expression neutral, but his attention focused entirely on her. "Your Majesty, honored guests," Rosalind began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I am Rosalind Thorne, translator of ancient texts, student of linguistic evolution, and, as was recently pointed out, possessor of a provincial accent that marks me as somewhat less than civilized." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the audience. Lord Cassian's smirk widened. "Tonight," Rosalind continued, "I'd like to share with you an art form from the Third Dynasty, a period when vampire courtiers elevated insults to high art through linguistic sophistication. I've translated several examples from Old Vampiric and will perform them in the original language, followed by translations that capture both the surface meaning and the hidden criticism." She took a breath. This was it. "The first poem," she said, and then began to speak in Old Vampiric, a language that flowed like honey and cut like glass, all rolling vowels and sharp consonants that required precise enunciation. Her accent, her Highland cadence, somehow fit the ancient tongue perfectly. The rhythm she'd grown up with, the musical quality of mountain speech, gave the Old Vampiric an authenticity that flatter, more refined accents would have lacked. She recited the first poem, a piece that appeared to praise a courtier's fashion sense, but actually suggested his clothes were the only remarkable thing about him. The audience laughed, appreciating the cleverness. The second poem appeared to compliment someone's eloquence, but implied they talked too much and said too little. More laughter, louder now. The third poem, and this was where Rosalind's heart pounded, appeared to praise someone's refinement while actually suggesting they were so obsessed with superficial elegance that they'd forgotten the purpose of language was communication rather than performance. She delivered it looking directly at Lord Cassian, her pronunciation flawless, her accent making the Old Vampiric sound more authentic than any refined speaker could have managed. The audience understood. The laughter was thunderous. Lord Cassian's face flushed, as much as a vampire's face could flush, with recognition that he'd just been publicly, elegantly insulted using linguistic techniques he couldn't have parsed if his immortal life depended on it. Rosalind performed 5 more poems, each demonstrating different linguistic devices, each showing the sophistication and complexity of a language that required not just memorization, but deep understanding of cultural context, historical period, and social dynamics. She explained each technique as she went, teaching even as she performed, demonstrating that her expertise was legitimate and hard-won. By the time she finished, the audience was on their feet. Not just polite applause, but genuine appreciation for a performance that had been educational, entertaining, and, in the case of Lord Cassian, perfectly, justifiably vindictive. King Lucian stood, which caused everyone else to sit immediately. He walked onto the stage, approached Rosalind, and spoke clearly enough for the entire hall to hear. "Miss Thorne, that was extraordinary. Your command of Old Vampiric exceeds that of most scholars I've encountered in 4 centuries. Your ability to explain complex linguistic concepts clearly, and your choice of material," he smiled slightly, "was both bold and entirely appropriate." He turned to address the audience. "Let this performance stand as a reminder that accent is not the same as ability, that provincial origins do not preclude excellence, and that the difference between mockery and wit is whether one possesses the intelligence to understand what one is mocking." His gaze landed on Lord Cassian. "Some of us do. Others might benefit from translation services." The audience erupted in laughter again. Lord Cassian looked as though he wanted to sink through the floor. King Lucian turned back to Rosalind. "I would like to commission you for a larger project. The royal archives contain thousands of documents in Old Vampiric that have never been properly translated. I'd like you to lead that effort. Room and board at the palace, substantial salary, full access to resources." "You're pointedly," he emphasized the word pointedly, "makes you uniquely qualified to understand the authentic pronunciation and cultural context of texts from that era. Interested?" Rosalind's mind reeled. A royal commission? Leading a major translation project? Everything she dreamed of academically, handed to her because she'd been brave enough to turn humiliation into triumph. "Yes, Your Majesty," she managed. "I would be honored." "Excellent. See Chancellor Chen after the event to discuss details. And Miss Thorne," he lowered his voice slightly, "thank you for reminding my court that elegance without substance is just elaborate emptiness. We needed that reminder." The aftermath of the performance unfolded over the following days in ways Rosalind couldn't have predicted. First, Lord Cassian approached her, not immediately, but 3 days later when she was in the archives beginning preliminary work on the translation project. He looked uncomfortable, which gave her more satisfaction than it probably should have. "Miss Thorne," he said stiffly, "a moment, if I may." Rosalind set down the manuscript she'd been examining. "Lord Cassian, I owe you an apology. My comments at the banquet were cruel and unwarranted. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on superficial markers rather than actual competence. That was wrong." He paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally to someone accustomed to being admired. "Your performance was exceptional. The translation work was sophisticated, the historical context was accurate, and your pronunciation of Old Vampiric was better than mine, which I find both humbling and somewhat irritating." Despite herself, Rosalind almost smiled. "I accept your apology, Lord Cassian, though I admit I'm surprised you're offering it." "King Lucian suggested that if I didn't apologize sincerely, he'd assign me to work as your assistant on the translation project for the next year." "I have no interest in dusty manuscripts, so here I am." He met her eyes. "But even without that threat, I would have come eventually. What I did was the behavior of someone who mistakes performance for substance. You proved the difference. That's worth acknowledging." After he left, Chancellor Marguerite Chen appeared. He didn't mention that King Lucian also privately informed him that mocking guests at diplomatic functions reflected poorly on the entire court, and future incidents would result in his dismissal from court positions. His Majesty did that? His Majesty has very particular standards about cruelty. He finds it distasteful under any circumstances, but especially when directed at those who can't easily defend themselves. Marguerite smiled. Though you defended yourself remarkably well. I haven't seen someone use old vampiric insult poetry that effectively in 200 years. Where did you learn the performance techniques? I didn't, really. I just read the poems aloud the way they felt like they should be read. The Highland cadence fit the rhythm. Exactly. You understood something that formal training often misses. That ancient languages were spoken by real people with regional variations and distinctive cadences. Your provincial accent gave you insight that someone trained in proper pronunciation would have missed. Marguerite handed her a key. Your new quarters in the palace. Larger than the diplomatic wing rooms, with an attached study. His Majesty thought you'd want space for your work. The rooms were indeed larger. A bedroom, sitting room, and study that overlooked the palace gardens. A desk already held stacks of manuscripts awaiting translation. And the bookshelves were stocked with reference materials she hadn't even requested yet. On the desk was a note in elegant script. Miss Thorne, welcome to your new position. I look forward to seeing what insights you bring to our historical records. Your accent, your background, your perspective, these are assets, not liabilities. Anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to translate a single page of old vampiric themselves and discover exactly how difficult your work is. Should you need anything for your research, you need only ask. L.A. Rosalind sat at the desk, surrounded by ancient manuscripts and modern comforts, and finally allowed herself to fully process what had happened. A week ago, she'd been humiliated at a banquet. Today, she had a royal commission, palace quarters, and respect from the most sophisticated court in the known world. The transformation hadn't happened through magic or luck. It had happened because she'd been given an opportunity and been brave enough to seize it. Because she'd turned her perceived weakness, her accent, her background, into a strength by demonstrating that authenticity and expertise mattered more than superficial polish. Over the following weeks, Rosalind settled into her new role. The translation project was enormous, thousands of documents ranging from administrative records to personal correspondence, from legal codes to poetry. Each text revealed something new about the Third Dynasty, and Rosalind found herself not just translating, but truly understanding the culture that had produced them. She also found herself, somewhat surprisingly, becoming part of court life. Not as someone trying to fit in, but as someone whose distinctive perspective was valued. Other scholars sought her opinion on linguistic puzzles. Courtiers asked about historical context for various traditions. Even King Lucian occasionally requested her presence at diplomatic meetings where her translation skills and her ability to parse subtle linguistic implications proved valuable. 6 months after her performance, Rosalind was invited to a small, private dinner with King Lucian, Chancellor Chen, and a few senior advisors. It was informal, or as informal as anything involving a vampire king could be, and the conversation ranged across topics from politics to philosophy to the amusing challenges of translating ancient profanity. Miss Thorne, King Lucian said as the evening wound down, I'm curious. When you received my invitation to perform, did you consider declining? Yes, Your Majesty, extensively. I was terrified I'd fail spectacularly and confirm everything Lord Cassian implied about provincial girls not belonging in refined spaces. What changed your mind? Rosalind thought about it. Curiosity, mostly. I couldn't figure out why you'd invited me specifically, and I couldn't live with not knowing. Also, she hesitated, then decided honesty. I was angry. Not just at Lord Cassian, though certainly at him, But at every person who'd ever suggested that where I came from or how I spoke determined what I was capable of, I wanted to prove them wrong. And did you? I think so, though I've learned something interesting in the process. Which is that proving them wrong wasn't actually the most satisfying part. The most satisfying part was discovering that I didn't need to prove anything, that the skills and knowledge I'd developed were valuable in their own right, regardless of whether people initially recognized that. The performance wasn't really about Lord Cassian. It was about me finally believing I belonged in spaces I'd always thought were off-limits to people like me. King Lucian nodded slowly. That's wisdom that takes some people centuries to acquire. You've learned it in your 20s. May I tell you why I invited you to perform? I'd very much like to know. I was at the banquet when Lord Cassian mocked you. I watched your face, watched you try to laugh it off, try to be gracious, and then watched that facade crack as you realized he'd publicly marked you as inferior. I watched you retreat to a corner and spend the rest of the evening pretending to be fine while clearly being devastated. He paused. I've lived 400 years, Miss Thorne. I've seen countless talented individuals destroyed not by lack of ability, but by being convinced by others that they didn't belong. I decided I'd had enough of watching that happen. So the invitation was me giving you a platform to demonstrate what I already knew from reviewing your translation work, that you're exceptionally talented and that your background is an asset, not a liability. I didn't know what you'd choose to perform, but I trusted you'd find something appropriate. You exceeded my expectations considerably. The insult poetry was perhaps a bit pointed. The insult poetry was perfect. It demonstrated your capabilities while also making clear that sophistication isn't about accent or origin. It's about depth of knowledge and skill in application. Lord Cassian learned that lesson, the court learned it, and I hope you learned it as well. Rosalind smiled. I'm learning it. It's still difficult sometimes, feeling like I belong here. That feeling never entirely goes away, King Lucian said. I've ruled for 4 centuries and still sometimes feel like an imposter in my own court. The key is recognizing that the feeling is just that, a feeling, not a fact. The facts are that you're an exceptional scholar doing groundbreaking work on historical documents that have been neglected for centuries. The facts are that you've brought insights no one else could have contributed. The facts are that you belong here because your work matters, not because someone granted you permission to exist in this space. After the dinner, walking back to her quarters through the palace gardens, Rosalind reflected on the strange trajectory her life had taken. From humiliation at a banquet to a royal commission, from feeling like an outsider to being valued for her unique perspective, from hiding her accent to understanding it as an asset that connected her to the authentic pronunciation of ancient languages. She thought about Lord Cassian's mockery, which at the time had felt devastating, but in retrospect had been a catalyst. Without that moment of humiliation, she might never have been given the opportunity to prove herself. Without that push, she might have spent years being competent but invisible, doing good work but never being recognized for it. Sometimes, she realized, the people who try to diminish you accidentally give you exactly the motivation you need to exceed even your own expectations. A year after the performance, the royal demonstration of arts came around again. This time, Rosalind attended as an established member of the court rather than a nervous translator hoping not to embarrass herself. Lord Cassian was performing, a reading of his own poetry, which was apparently quite good. He'd developed something resembling humility over the past year, or at least had learned to keep his cruelty to himself. They'd even developed a cordial working relationship. He'd consulted her twice about historical references in his work. After his performance, which received genuine applause, he found Rosalind in the crowd. "Honest assessment?" he asked. "Very good. The imagery in the third stanza was particularly strong, though I'd suggest luminescent rather than glowing in line 17. It scans better and is more precise." "I'll consider that." He paused. "I've been working on something, an apology poem actually, about the danger of mistaking elegance for expertise. Would you be willing to review it before I share it more widely?" Rosalind was surprised. "You're writing about the Banquet incident?" "About my behavior at it, yes. I've realized that apologizing privately was necessary but not sufficient. I publicly mocked you. I should publicly acknowledge that mistake. I'm not suggesting this will undo the harm, but perhaps it will prevent me from being quite so awful in the future." He smiled ruefully. "Or at least give people permission to mock me if I backslide. I'd be happy to review it." 2 weeks later, Lord Cassian performed the apology poem at a smaller court gathering. It was witty, self-deprecating, and genuinely insightful about the ways superiority complexes mask insecurity. Rosalind found herself impressed, not just by the skill of the writing, but by the growth it represented. After the performance, King Lucian approached her in the gardens where she retreated to think. "Lord Cassian's poem was interesting," he observed. "It was good, more self-aware than I would have expected a year ago." People can surprise you. Given the right incentives and time, even those who seem irredeemably awful can develop something resembling character. He looked at her. "Your translation project is remarkably well. Chancellor Chen tells me you've completed preliminary work on 3,000 documents with detailed annotations that are already being cited by scholars across the territories. The work is fascinating, Your Majesty. Every document reveals something new about Third Dynasty culture. Did you know they had explicit laws about kindness to servants? Very progressive for their era." "I did not. That's exactly the kind of insight I hoped you'd uncover." He paused. "I wanted to ask, are you happy here? Is this work fulfilling?" Rosalind considered the question seriously. "Yes, more than I ever imagined being. Not just the work itself, though that's wonderful, but I feel like I've found where I'm supposed to be. Like all the difficulties, the mockery, the feeling of not belonging, the struggle to be taken seriously, were somehow necessary to get me here." Does that make sense? Perfect sense. The difficult paths often lead to the most valuable destinations. King Lucian smiled. "I'm pleased. You've contributed more to our understanding of our own history in 1 year than the previous 3 translators managed in a decade combined. That's remarkable. Thank you, Your Majesty. Though I have to ask, why did you really create this position? The archives needed translation, certainly, but you could have hired any number of scholars. Why invest in defending someone you'd barely met?" King Lucian looked out at the gardens, where early spring flowers were beginning to bloom. "Because I'm 400 years old, Miss Thorne, and I've learned that power is only meaningful if it's used to enable others rather than simply maintain itself. I have authority, resources, position. What good is any of that if I don't use it to create opportunities for those who've been unfairly overlooked?" He turned back to her. "You were humiliated for something completely unrelated to your capabilities. Lord Cassian mocked your accent as though pronunciation determined worth, as though being from the Highlands made you somehow less intelligent or capable. That kind of provincial prejudice has been holding talented people back for centuries. I decided to push back against it in the way I could, by giving you a platform to prove that talent transcends origin. You took a risk on me. Minimal risk. I'd reviewed your translation work before issuing the invitation. I knew you were talented. The performance was simply making that talent visible to people who'd otherwise overlook it." He smiled. Though I admit, I didn't predict you'd use old vampiric insult poetry quite so effectively against the person who'd mocked you. That was inspired." Rosalind laughed. It felt appropriate. Make the point while demonstrating the capability. Plus, I confess, it was satisfying, as it should have been. Vindication through excellence is far more effective than revenge through cruelty. You proved that beautifully. As King Lucian left to attend to other duties, Rosalind remained in the gardens, thinking about the strange year she'd experienced. From being mocked at a banquet to leading a royal translation project, from feeling like she didn't belong to understanding that belonging wasn't about permission, it was about contribution. She thought about the girl she'd been a year ago, so worried about pronouncing French words correctly that she'd forgotten she could translate entire ancient languages. She thought about how much energy she'd wasted trying to fit into expectations that were never designed to accommodate people like her. And she thought about what she'd learned, that the people who mock your differences are usually those who have nothing but superficial polish to offer. That real expertise is recognizable regardless of accent. That provincial origins can be strengths rather than weaknesses if you own them instead of apologizing for them. The irony wasn't lost on her. Lord Cassian had tried to diminish her by pointing out how she was different. In doing so, he'd accidentally given King Lucian the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that difference could be valuable. Sometimes, she realized, the best revenge isn't direct retaliation. It's becoming so undeniably successful that your previous critics have no choice but to acknowledge they were wrong. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the people who hurt you accidentally give you exactly the catalyst you need to stop holding yourself back. Epilogue. 2 years later. The Royal Archives project was completed to international acclaim. Rosalind's translations had revealed insights about Third Dynasty governance, culture, and social structures that fundamentally changed scholarly understanding of that era. 3 universities had offered her positions. 2 royal courts had requested her consultation on their own historical documents. And she'd been invited to present her findings at the Continental Congress of Historical Scholars, the most prestigious academic gathering in the known world. She declined all the external offers and remained at King Lucian's court, where she'd been promoted to royal historian with expanded responsibilities for preserving and interpreting the kingdom's extensive archives. The position came with additional privileges, including a seat at court functions that was no longer positioned at the periphery but among the senior advisors. Lord Cassian, now a genuine friend rather than a reformed critic, had joked that she'd become more influential than half the nobility. On the evening of the 3rd anniversary of her famous performance, King Lucian hosted a small celebration in her honor. The guest list included the scholars who'd worked on the translation project, several diplomats whose negotiations had benefited from her historical insights, and a few courtiers who'd become genuine colleagues. During the dinner, Ambassador Helena Winters approached Rosalind with a warm smile. "I remember when you were terrified to attend that first banquet. Look at you now, hosting celebrations, respected across territories, completely comfortable in your own skin. It's remarkable." "I had good incentives to develop confidence," Rosalind said, gesturing to King Lucian. "Having a vampire king publicly declare your accent an asset rather than a liability does wonders for self-esteem." He saw what others missed. But you did the work. The translations, the research, the constant effort to be better. That's not something anyone could have done for you. Later, when most guests had departed, Rosalind found herself alone with King Lucian in the library where she'd first discovered the insult poetry that had changed her life. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. For the invitation, the position, the opportunities. For believing I had value when others saw only provincial roughness." "I should be thanking you," King Lucian replied. You've contributed more to preserving our history than I could have hoped. But more than that, you've reminded my court that excellence comes in many forms, that diversity of perspective makes us stronger, and that the most dangerous people are those who mistake polish for substance. Did Lord Cassian really teach you anything? He learned that cruelty has consequences, that mockery says more about the mocker than the target, that real sophistication includes kindness, or at minimum, the grace to let people make mistakes without public humiliation. King Lucian smiled. He's become quite a good poet, actually. Self-awareness suits him. Strange how being humbled can improve people. Not so strange. Most of us need to be confronted with our flaws before we'll address them. Lord Cassian needed to be publicly outperformed by someone he dismissed as inferior. That revelation forced growth. Rosalind looked at the shelves of books surrounding them. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, written in dozens of languages, preserved so that future generations could learn from the past. I used to think I'd never belong in spaces like this, that libraries and courts and academic gatherings were for other people. People with better backgrounds, proper accents, connections I'd never have. And now? Now I understand that belonging isn't granted by others. It's claimed through contribution. I belong here because my work matters, because the insights I bring are valuable, because I've earned my place through capability rather than pedigree. That's more secure than any position granted through social connection alone. That's wisdom that took me decades to acquire. You've learned it remarkably quickly. I had an excellent teacher and spectacular motivation from someone who wanted to humiliate me. She smiled. I should probably send Lord Cassian a thank you note. His mockery was the catalyst for everything good that's happened since. I believe he's aware. He mentioned to me last month that watching you succeed has been more educational than any formal lesson in humility could have been. As Rosalind left the library that evening, walking through palace corridors she now navigated with easy confidence, she thought about the girl who'd mispronounced hors d'oeuvre 3 years ago and been mocked by a courtier who thought accent determined worth. That girl had been humiliated, certainly, but she'd also been brave enough to accept a terrifying invitation, creative enough to turn linguistic expertise into compelling performance, and confident enough to use her perceived weaknesses as strengths. Lord Cassian had tried to diminish her by highlighting how she was different. Instead, he'd accidentally revealed exactly what made her valuable: perspective that came from being outside the traditional elite, understanding that came from working twice as hard to earn half the recognition, authenticity that came from refusing to pretend to be something she wasn't. The revenge had been perfect because it wasn't revenge at all. It was simply excellence that couldn't be dismissed or diminished, capability that demanded recognition, contribution that proved worth in ways mockery never could. Sometimes, the best response to cruelty isn't cruelty in return. It's becoming so undeniably remarkable that your critics have no choice but to acknowledge they were wrong. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the people who try to diminish you accidentally give you exactly the push you need to become extraordinary. The irony wasn't lost on her. Lord Cassian had tried to diminish her by pointing out how she was different. In doing so, he'd accidentally given King Lucian the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that difference could be valuable. Sometimes, she realized, the best revenge isn't direct retaliation. It's becoming so undeniably successful that your previous critics have no choice but to acknowledge they were wrong. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the people who hurt you accidentally give you exactly the catalyst you need to stop holding yourself back. Epilogue. 2 years later. The Royal Archives project was completed to international acclaim. Rosalind's translations had revealed insights about Third Dynasty governance, culture, and social structures that fundamentally changed scholarly understanding of that era. 3 universities had offered her positions. 2 royal courts had requested her consultation on their own historical documents, and she'd been invited to present her findings at the Continental Congress of Historical Scholars, the most prestigious academic gathering in the known world. She declined all the external offers and remained at King Lucian's court, where she'd been promoted to royal historian with expanded responsibilities for preserving and interpreting the kingdom's extensive archives. The position came with additional privileges, including a seat at court functions that was no longer positioned at the periphery but among the senior advisors. Lord Cassian, now a genuine friend rather than a reformed critic, had joked that she'd become more influential than half the nobility. On the evening of the 3rd anniversary of her famous performance, King Lucian hosted a small celebration in her honor. The guest list included the scholars who'd worked on the translation project, several diplomats whose negotiations had benefited from her historical insights, and a few courtiers who'd become genuine colleagues. During the dinner, Ambassador Helena Winters approached Rosalind with a warm smile. "I remember when you were terrified to attend that first banquet. Look at you now, hosting celebrations, respected across territories, completely comfortable in your own skin. It's remarkable." "I had good incentives to develop confidence," Rosalind said, gesturing to King Lucian. "Having a vampire king publicly declare your accent an asset rather than a liability does wonders for self-esteem. He saw what others missed, but you did the work, the translations, the research, the constant effort to be better. That's not something anyone could have done for you." Later, when most guests had departed, Rosalind found herself alone with King Lucian in the library where she'd first discovered the insult poetry that had changed her life. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for the invitation, the position, the opportunities, for believing I had value when others saw only provincial roughness." "I should be thanking you," King Lucian replied. "You've contributed more to preserving our history than I could have hoped. But more than that, you've reminded my court that excellence comes in many forms, that diversity of perspective makes us stronger, and that the most dangerous people are those who mistake polish for substance." Did Lord Cassian really teach you anything? He learned that cruelty has consequences, that mockery says more about the mocker than the target, that real sophistication includes kindness, or at minimum, the grace to let people make mistakes without public humiliation. King Lucian smiled. He's become quite a good poet, actually. Self-awareness suits him. Strange how being humbled can improve people. Not so strange. Most of us need to be confronted with our flaws before we'll address them. Lord Cassian needed to be publicly outperformed by someone he dismissed as inferior. That revelation forced growth. Rosalind looked at the shelves of books surrounding them, centuries of accumulated knowledge written in dozens of languages, preserved so that future generations could learn from the past. "I used to think I'd never belong in spaces like this, that libraries and courts and academic gatherings were for other people, people with better backgrounds, proper accents, connections I'd never have. And now? Now I understand that belonging isn't granted by others, it's claimed through contribution. I belong here because my work matters, because the insights I bring are valuable, because I've earned my place through capability rather than pedigree. That's more secure than any position granted through social connection alone. That's wisdom that took me decades to acquire. You've learned it remarkably quickly. I had an excellent teacher, and spectacular motivation from someone who wanted to humiliate me." She smiled. "I should probably send Lord Cassian a thank you note. His mockery was the catalyst for everything good that's happened since. I believe he's aware. He mentioned to me last month that watching you succeed has been more educational than any formal lesson in humility could have been. As Rosalind left the library that evening, walking through palace corridors she now navigated with easy confidence, she thought about the girl who'd mispronounced hors d'oeuvres 3 years ago and been mocked by a courtier who thought accent determined worth. That girl had been humiliated, certainly, but she'd also been brave enough to accept a terrifying invitation, creative enough to turn linguistic expertise into compelling performance, and confident enough to use her perceived weaknesses as strengths. Lord Cassian had tried to diminish her by highlighting how she was different. Instead, he'd accidentally revealed exactly what made her valuable: perspective that came from being outside the traditional elite, understanding that came from working twice as hard to earn half the recognition, authenticity that came from refusing to pretend to be something she wasn't. The revenge had been perfect because it wasn't revenge at all. It was simply excellence that couldn't be dismissed or diminished, capability that demanded recognition, contribution that proved worth in ways mockery never could. Sometimes the best response to cruelty isn't cruelty in return. It's becoming so undeniably remarkable that your critics have no choice but to acknowledge they were wrong. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the people who try to diminish you accidentally give you exactly the push you need to become extraordinary.